I'm the chair of environmental studies at University of Portland, and most of the work that I do relates to issues of salmon recovery planning, water quality issues, surface water contaminants, and I work a lot with a colleague who's has an ethical perspective to try and bring a combined scientific and ethical background to considerations of policy issues. The most significant power in this kind of circumstance is the power to ask the questions, not the power to provide the answers. So when the first Columbia River Treaty was negotiated, the only questions that were asked were about hydroelectric power and flood control. And so the answers could only occur in a very narrow range. The privilege of asking the questions has to be broadened out. Answers can be discussed and debated, but not if the wrong questions have been asked at the beginning. The Columbia River Treaty between the U.S. and Canada is 50 years old and can now be renegotiated, and in 10 years could be canceled if it doesn't come to a new agreement. The original treaty left out salmon, it left out the tribes, it left out the First Nations in Canada. The only thing that the original treaty negotiators cared about were hydroelectric power and flood control. And now, especially in an era of changing climate and changing rainfall patterns, we need to think very seriously about what a just and functional treaty for the future would be. Well, for one thing, the way that we're operating the hydroelectric system right now is slowly but steadily destroying the salmon. And the salmon runs are part of the identity of this region. People think now that a good run of salmon, we have a really peak year and people are happy. It's maybe 10% of what we had historically. And we need, if we're going to save the wildlife of the region, to operate the dams quite differently. And it's a complicated issue. Right now, when they talk about releasing water to preserve the salmon, the hydropower system views that as income that they're not getting because it could be used to generate more electricity. So the relationship between wildlife and electricity generation is going to be crucial. But also in an era of climate change, you have to say that the hydroelectric dams don't generate carbon dioxide. And it's not like we want to be replacing them with enormous amounts of natural gas-fired turbines or something, because we also need not to be releasing CO2 in the atmosphere. So those hydro dams are a real two-edged sword for us. Then the reservoir systems have a real function in flood control. In this region, as it's grown more populous, we have more and more people around the river. We've simplified the structure of the rivers in this region. We've removed side channels, we've reduced floodplains, we've changed them into agricultural land. All of those changes actually make the river system less capable of dealing with floodwater. And so we've modified ourselves and built ourselves a river that's more flood prone and more dangerous for people than the original river. Then we've dispossessed both the First Nations and the Native Americans, really quite an abrogation of our own laws. The treaties that the Native Americans signed, ratified by the Senate, were ignored. The treaties that the First Nations had were ignored. And so just in terms of legal justice, we need to reconsider our commitment to our own laws. There's been a great deal of flooding of the traditional homelands of the Native Americans and the First Nations, including things like ancestral burial sites and things that matter to them a great deal have been lost. And they were promised in treaty that that sort of thing would never happen. And those are all going to be huge issues. Then the projections about what's going to happen to the climate, the projections about what's going to happen to the population. There'll be more of us, a lot more of us. And the summer flows are going to be lower in the river because there'll be less snow melt. So they may have to operate the reservoir system in quite a different way to maintain the summer flows compared to what they're doing now. Even if we didn't want to change things, they'd have to. It's a changing climate, it's a growing population. Even if there were no ethical imperative to begin to operate this system more justly to meet conflicting rights and claims, we would have to, because the region will change. There's only something like 15 million people in the Northwest right now, painting the Northwest broadly. That's going to be doubling by 2050 probably. I've seen projections that by 2100 there'll be 68 million people in the region. We need to be intentional. We need to understand what our finite resources are, how the management of those resources needs to change, and we need to plan ourselves a future that looks something like what we want. So there'll be more people, less water, and really a sustainable situation is all about communities where the cost isn't borne by just a few groups. And I think it's pretty indisputable that the costs have been borne by the First Nations and the Native Americans. This is not an economic issue. This is an issue of economics and justice. And it needs to be an insistent call for social justice in this renegotiation. We got where we are because the only things in the original negotiation were economic factors. And that has to be prevented this time. I think personally people in this region really should be making common cause as much as we possibly can, so that the message that goes to the federal governments is strong, well supported by a lot of people, and appears like a solution that they're willing to adopt, because we are a long way in both Canada and the U.S. from the seats of power here.
Thing, and this is important stuff that the whole region should know about.
Well, no one knows about it because nothing's happened since 1964. I mean, this was passed September of 1964. There's been no discussion. There's been no renegotiation because the first treaty period was 50 years. So the 50 years has just passed, and it takes 10 years warning for either side to pull out of the treaty. So, of course, people began to attend to it right away, because if they were going to pull out of the original treaty, even if the U.S. or Canada decided right now to do that, it couldn't do it till 2024. So what we're really discussing now is what's going to happen in 2024, and we haven't bothered to talk about it because it's been a half a century with no activity. So we take as kind of the status quo a half a century of inertia on this. We know a lot more than we knew 50 years ago. And honestly, the world's a lot different place than it was 50 years ago. The economy of this region is a lot different than it was 50 years ago. Our recognition of social injustice is much greater than it was 50 years ago. And so I don't think there's any question we can do a whole lot better than we did. Not to say that it's automatic that we're going to do a great job, but I think we could. And yeah, it's an unexamined and pretty complicated, enormously complicated situation. And you talk to the Native Americans or the First Nations, and honestly, they have every right to be mad. They just got forgotten. And I think what we need to see is engagement of congregations and churches and mosques and synagogues together to raise the importance of this as an ethical issue. I think there has to be considerable pressure put on the politicians in the region who are involved in these negotiations. And I think essentially it's lobbying, involvement, and a call to justice. Yeah, it's a call to justice.